Hello everyone, my name is Andrew and welcome back to Frames of Space.
Today's guest is Damon Linker, who is a journalist, lecturer, and the writer behind the Substack known as Notes from the Middleground, where he covers Trump, the broader MAGA movement, and a lot of the effect that they've been having on American politics for the past decade. You see, during Trump's first term, Damon was one of the more skeptical voices on the anti-Trump side. He worried that resistance had become overheated, too quick to treat every single provocation as an existential crisis, and too willing to let panic crowd out rational judgment. And I think that history matters because nowadays Damon thinks that the situation is genuinely worse than he expected. In this episode, we talk about what has changed in Trump's second term and why Damon believes that the response to Trump today has been more restrained and in many ways more admirable than it was 8 years ago. Not because the stakes are lower, far from it. Instead, it's because the people pushing back seem more conscious of how overreaction can backfire and more disciplined, more focused on retaining credibility. And nowhere is that restraint more visible than in Minneapolis, where federal immigration enforcement has surged in a deep blue city far, far away from the U.S.-Mexico border. This episode touches on the killings of Renee Good and Alex Preddy and how those deaths altered the political dynamics almost immediately. What was framed as law enforcement has begun to look, to many Americans, like martial law. So one last thing before I start the episode, which is that this episode was recorded on Tuesday, and the day after, the Trump administration decided that it would withdraw a decent percentage of the ICE officers on the ground from Minneapolis. So unfortunately, we didn't get to touch on that. But I do think that the vast majority of this recording does hold up and is still very, very relevant to the situation on the ground. So yeah, I hope you enjoy. Damon Linker, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this podcast.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, and I'm very glad you're here as well. I do want to talk quite a bit about the events that are unfolding in Minneapolis, but maybe it's good to give the audience a background about you and what your views traditionally have been. Maybe a good starting point would be, how did you feel about Trump's first term as it was unfolding?
Well, it was clear from the beginning, and by beginning I mean from the time of the start of the Republican primaries in 2016, that Trump represented a break from the past. He definitely burst on the scene by opposing the establishments, not only of the Democratic Party, but of the Republican Party as well as elites in other segments of the culture and society. And so he was clearly a more rabid populist than we had seen before. And, very quickly then we had the Brexit vote in the UK, which showed that this actually isn't just an American experience that we were going through here, that there was something broader going on in the world of the world's liberal democracies. And then during the first term of Trump, it was clear that he was attempting to kind of break out of standard liberal democratic governance in all kinds of ways, trying to break on the level of policy, but also procedurally, sort of how he wanted to go about things, wanted to govern through a kind of decree rather than through the more kind of slower going bureaucratically methodical ways that the executive branch typically presides within our system, with Congress obviously playing a big role. So like Trump didn't really try to pass a significant immigration reform bill. There was an immigration reform bill in like 2013, 2014 that went down to defeat after it looked like for a while like it might pass. Marco Rubio played a big role in trying to get that through in Congress, but it didn't pass. And Trump didn't say, okay, let's do that again, but do it right by really cutting rates of immigration. Instead, he tried to use the institutions of the executive branch and executive orders to curtail immigration, to engage in deportations, family separation policies, and so forth. Some of those worked, some didn't work. But, this expanded into foreign policy and other areas as well. The thing that seems most different today is that Trump now has a lot more people around him in his administration who are firmly share his aspirations, both in how to govern and in what to do with power. And so they're moving on like 18 fronts at once. They're constantly trying to do new, more extreme acts in a kind of dictatorial way, top down, both within the executive branch and then with the executive branch vis-a-vis the legislative and judicial branches. So it's like I originally saw a lot of the dangers that Trump posed, but the system sort of held more in the first term than it has now, because Trump is more competent, or at least is surrounded by people who sort of know how to use power more effectively to get to help Trump do what he wants.
I'm kind of fascinating. Like, there is a marked difference between what you thought the second Trump term would be and the way that it's unfolding. Maybe I'll refresh your memory a little bit. There's the month before the 2024 election, you wrote an article about this where I'm just going to quote it wholesale. You said, "I fear a Donald Trump victory next Tuesday. That's because I fear what Trump will try to do and succeed in doing as president. But also because I dread having to live through a revival of the quote-unquote resistance among leading left-leaning journalists, intellectuals, academics, and activists. Many of these people and institutions were gripped by a form of frenzied madness during the Trump administration, careening wildly from one hyped-up, exaggerated news story to the next. We were a country, or at least its most educated and informed citizens, having a nervous breakdown," end quote. Could you describe your thought process a little bit when it comes to the way that you would describe the resistance during the first Trump presidency?
Well, I mean, my analysis of what's going on with Trump has always had a few dimensions, one of which is just to look at Trump and what he's trying to do, where he comes from on the right in this country, and then more international context with the rise of the populist right around the world. But then in another dimension, it's important, I've always thought, to view Trump not in isolation as, there are some people on the anti-Trump side of things, which is where I place myself as well, but a lot of people in that segment of punditry, if you will, or analysis, who basically say, like, the Democrats are normal, everything in America would be normal except for this guy who sort of came out of nowhere and is single-handedly trying to impose a kind of dictatorship, and the Republican Party and its voters have just gone insane, and we're kind of lashed to them because they're our fellow citizens, but they are the 100% origin of this, and it's all a function of them and their pathologies. I've never been entirely persuaded of that. I think that you have to view Trump not entirely in isolation, but as emerging from out of long-standing tensions between the right and the broader left and center left. And I do think that during the first Trump administration, Trump said a lot of crazy stuff, and he was like a lunatic in a lot of ways, especially at the level of public rhetoric that was totally off the grid of normal. And a lot of people, I think, who opposed him sort of took that language as a provocation to I think, in a way, overstate things at certain key junctures, to kind of avoid any kind of deep soul searching on the part of Democrats about the problems of the Hillary Clinton faction of the Democratic Party. And instead to say, blame Vladimir Putin. Like, why do we have Trump? Well, because Vladimir Putin wanted Trump in charge. Trump is an asset from Russia. He's basically controlled by the Russian intelligence establishment. And a lot of that was a kind of, centrist conspiracy theorizing that I think led to a lot of mistakes and kind of overplaying of hands and making claims that never got substantiated in the public record. And so I feared a return to that, and also what's called wokeness, which began before Trump. It began in the 2013 time period in the very first years of smartphones and social media apps and so forth that allowed the networking of a certain more rabid progressive tendency on the left to become more formidable. And then Trump burst on the scene and he actually won, and that led a lot of those people to become much more potent in their ability to exert will within liberal institutions, which ended up sort of giving fuel to what Trump was trying to do, sort of giving material to the right to justify what Trump was trying to do. So that there was a kind of symbiosis between the first Trump administration and the rise of the woke left that I was also not looking forward to returning to. I think it's actually played out, as you indicated, a little bit differently than I was talking about, in part because Trump has been so much more aggressive this second time and effective, I think, in actually doing things. Combined with the fact that he won the election in 2024 by a wider margin, actually won a plurality and close to a majority, which forestalled the center-left Democratic Party from immediately coming out of the election and being able to kind of blame mysterious forces for putting him in charge. It was much harder for the Democratic establishment to deflect blame this time. And so I think both the center-left, more conspiracy-oriented resistance and the woke progressive tendency have both been a little bit more muted this time, as well as being a little bit more justified in some of what it has been saying. And frankly, I think, there has been some overplaying on the part of some of the protesters on the ground in Minneapolis. But for the most part, I think a lot of those people have been admirably restrained and sort of willing to take abuse on the part of ICE for the sake of discrediting them in the eyes of the public. And that's a kind of protest politics that, when handled well, as I think largely, not entirely, but largely it has been so far, that actually can be pretty effective in moving public opinion. So that's my long-winded answer to your provocation there.
Thank you for providing a long-winded answer to my provocation.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Maybe this is a good time to talk about ICE, because that's how you ended your last, that's how you ended your long-winded response.
Yes.
So where are the ICE agents currently located, and what is the current explanation for why they are located in the places where they are located?
Well, I think they're all over the place. They're expanding all the time. I know here in Philadelphia they haven't had a huge presence so far, but they opened a new office in the area just a little bit north of where I live in Center City. I heard yesterday that they purchased for tens of millions of dollars a warehouse in Berks County, which is not immediately adjacent to Philadelphia, but not that far away, in the broader area of southeastern Pennsylvania. And that, I assume, is a place where they want to warehouse people who get detained prior to deportation proceedings. So, they're expanding all over, but it is also true that by any kind of rational measure, ICE has been much more aggressively operating in clearly areas of the country where Trump knows it will provoke a reaction, namely in very blue cities. They've been in Washington, which is overwhelmingly a Democratic city.
Washington, D.C.
Yeah, Washington, D.C. They've been in L.A., the Los Angeles area in California, in Chicago, and of course, most recently, very heavy presence in Minneapolis. And why are they in Minneapolis, of all places, 1,500 miles from the southern border? Not even directly on the northern border with Canada, but why would they go there? Well, that's very obviously because there's been this big scandal involving the Somali immigrant community of Minneapolis that's gotten a lot of attention in the last couple of months. And the Trump administration, I think probably led by Stephen Miller, who's probably the most the most loathsome person working in the Trump White House. And he has a lot of power as a deputy chief of staff and the person mainly in charge of immigration policy in the White House. They have decided that they want to kind of flood Minneapolis, which isn't a very large city. And so originally, there were about as many ICE agents in the city as there are total civilian police officers in the city of Minneapolis. But now there are something on the order of 3 times as many ICE and Border Patrol agents in the city, which feels to a lot of Minneapolis residents like a kind of foreign occupation force. And that there have been a lot of anecdotal reports of just ordinary Minneapolis citizens, not people who, regularly go protest and so forth and kind of think of themselves as on the progressive left, but just ordinary people going to work who have been detained, often violently, by ICE officers without warrants. And they're responding to this, I think, quite understandably by showing up to say, what the hell are you doing? Get the hell out of here. We don't want you here. It feels like we're living under martial law by the federal government right now. And again, why would they be doing this? Rather than say in southern Texas on the border of Mexico, where the population has a lot of migrants who kind of flow back and forth over the border, or at least they did until the border has been effectively shut over the last year. And it's entirely because Trump knows, and Stephen Miller even more knows, that the people living in Minneapolis, because it is a very liberal city and, has a kind of Scandinavian welfare state outlook there in the city government are not going to respond well to it, and they will protest it and try to take issue, which will, they hope, create lots of, helpful for them in terms of propaganda purposes, images of protests that they hope to be able to use to justify even more heavy-handed tactics on the ground and hopefully shape public opinion in favor of what ICE is doing. It turns out that has backfired. Trump's support, both in approval ratings overall and then in terms of support for his handling of immigration, have both been going down pretty sharply in recent weeks because of the 2 killings and other acts of violence. So it's pretty bad, and it's being done very clearly for the sake of, I think, providing the administration with pretexts to ramp up their power grabs even more.
Theoretically, if the Trump administration wanted to ramp up its power grabs even more, what avenues could they use to do so successfully without engendering even more backlash?
I mean, I think already we're kind of in that dynamic where, like, if it's between the heavy-handed tactics provoking events that can be used as a pretext for even more heavy-handed acts, we've already seen that sort of backfire. Like that circuit of causality that I think Stephen Miller especially and Kristi Noem have wanted to push hasn't worked because we've had the 2 killings of Renee Good and Preddy. And so, it's sort of backfired, and what we've gotten instead is a little bit of the Trump administration backing off. Now, it seems like, they got rid of Bovino, the head of Border Patrol, and he's now sort of headed toward retirement. He's no longer in Minneapolis. We also have, just rhetorically, people around the Trump administration are seeming to be a little more conciliatory than they were a couple of weeks ago. Now, I don't think in the medium to long term, as far as the Trump approach to immigration, that this is signaling that we're kind of past the push on immigration from Trump. It's just that he did kind of step back a little bit because he saw that it was getting out of hand a little. So where it goes beyond now, I don't know, but they're strategizing. I do think that things are going to continue. There will continue to be provocations. There will continue to be the danger that the left will overplay its hand and in certain places sort of be seen as becoming the agents of chaos. That's sort of what we're dealing with here, is a kind of fight over optics. So, like, who's viewed as the bullies and aggressors, and who are the people who are standing up for American values? And so far, I think the protesters have been winning that battle in Minneapolis because people ended up dead, which I think a lot of Americans recognize is like overdoing it. And so the question is, will the balance continue to be, slanted in that direction as we head through the winter and into the spring, and ICE gets its act together? I say that a little ironically, but sort of gets and mobilizes itself in more blue cities like Philadelphia. And then how do the people who protest act? Do they kind of act responsibly, sort of standing back, mainly filming ICE as it overplays its hand and acts like a bunch of bullies and thugs, harming what seem to be like defenseless people, both American citizens who aren't, doing anything more than trying to just film what they do. And then also when it comes to immigrants, women and young children being separated from their parents, people who are dark-skinned and yet are American citizens or are permanent residents with green cards, and they're being abused. So it's like a propaganda battle between these two sides, and the trick to who ends up ahead in that optics battle depends very much, I think, on how, on just how, who appears to be the aggressor and who appears to be the victim.
Theoretically, if ICE agents decided to double down on their aggression and they decided to be even more carefree in their decision to just kill civilians for no reason, do you think that would be a net good or a net bad when it comes to their ability to effectively instill fear within the American populace?
Well, if it's just as one-sided as that, just suddenly, it's not that there are these two killings in Minneapolis, but regularly they're killing people, I think that would, especially if the people aren't really doing much, like Preddy was, he was disarmed, he was on the ground, he was subdued, and then they shot him 10 times in the back because someone yelled gun, which makes the ICE appear to be less than professional, trigger happy, and very, very dangerous. I think a lot of Americans were kind of appalled by that. So if that kind of thing if that continues to be something that happens, I think that's an overwhelmingly bad thing for the Trump administration. I think that very rapidly would increase sympathy for the protesters everywhere and raise animus on the part of American voters to the Trump administration and the way it's going about this. And then, you never know, that could eventually even lead, if you can believe it, Republicans in Congress to stand up to him and demand that ICE be restrained. So, would that be good for either side? It certainly would not be good for Trump's effort to institute a more fully kind of rigorous, consistent form of dictatorial oppression on the American people, because prior to it being instituted and consolidated, you would have so much opposition to it gaining public opinion that it probably would end up thwarting it. I think it would be, just to speak in purely terms of strategy, if Stephen Miller wants Trump to, govern like a dictator, then the best thing is to hope that ICE acts in a more professional and restrained way, and left-leaning protests in places overdo it, begin rioting, burning businesses, maybe attack ICE officers and hurt them or kill them, which would then give Trump, in the eyes of, I think, some Americans, an ample pretext to invoke the Insurrection Act, which would then give Trump massively greater powers to call up regular military troops and deploy them in cities as well, which could itself provoke more protests and violence from the left. So that's more of the scenario. But if the left doesn't take the bait, doesn't overplay its hand, and simply tries to document what ICE is doing, and ICE continues to act like unprofessional thugs in their dealings with people on the street, that would continue, I think, the pattern that we've seen so far in Minnesota.
Even if the left doesn't overplay its hand, you would agree that people within the Trump administration would still refer to victims of this ICE brutality. They would still refer to those victims as terrorists and so on and so forth. You would agree with that, right?
Meaning that the Trump people would call the protesters terrorists.
Yes.
Yes, they will, but it won't be effective. That's why I think, again, one of the things that blew up in the administration's face is that Stephen Miller and Kristi Noem came right out of the gate, within an hour or two of Preddy being murdered, and called him a domestic terrorist when all the video evidence and over that afternoon, that Saturday, the video evidence from multiple angles got published and disseminated on social media. And it was very clear that the guy had been hit. He was on the ground. They'd been pepper sprayed several times. He was disarmed of the weapon that he was carrying. And then he got shot in the back 10 times in like 3 seconds. So to call him a domestic terrorist backfired. It wasn't effective. Now, again, though, to go back to my prior point, if the protesters instead begin to seem like they're the aggressors, they're not just kicking in a tail light like Preddy seems to have done in another video that surfaced about a week after his death, but like actually physically assault ICE officers, even kill them, and so forth. Then if the administration calls them domestic terrorists, I think a larger number of Americans, not just MAGA types, but others would perhaps respond to that and be like, well, they have a point. They are sort of acting like terrorists. ICE is just trying to enforce immigration laws. They shouldn't be subject to this kind of abuse.
So one thing that I find really interesting about your commentary is how you try to approach like different political factions with empathy and nuance and charitability. Do you have like you've traditionally had a dispensation towards viewing Trump supporters with empathy and charitability? Would you consider that accurate?
Well, I mean, I've been a harsh Trump critic all along, although I do have analytical modes where I try to understand like where they're coming from and then why this pattern has recurred in so many places around the world. And so, I think a lot of pundits who are pro-Trump, whether they're center-right and anti-Trump, center-left, further left, tend to kind of fall into a pattern of just sort of attacking what Trump is doing and just kind of doing that all the time. All versions of this is bad, that's bad, it's all bad, this is why it's bad. And that gets repetitive, and I don't think in the end we really learn that much from it, even if I kind of agree that it's all bad. So I try to mix it up and combine talking about what they're doing and why it's bad with like trying to grasp why we're in this state. Like, yeah, he's bad, he's terrible. He tried to foment a self-coup, and yet he won the election 4 years later. A plurality of Americans looked at that guy who did all of that and decided, well, between that and Kamala Harris, I'll go for that. And like, that needs to be explained. That has to be accounted for. And so I try to write things that plumb those depths to try to understand it. Now, one thing that's happened, though, is that Trump has been so aggressive and so kind of pushing the boundaries of acceptable presidential behavior on so many fronts during this administration over the past year that I think I've written more pieces over the last year that kind of take the pure, harshly critical line about what Trump's doing than I used to. And then that's increased yet again over the last 2 to 3 weeks since Minnesota really spiraled out of control, because it really has the optics of pure fascism here. Like, it is, I think John Gantz, another Substacker who I read a lot and I've learned a lot from, he's to my left, but again, I learned a lot from him. He's very, very smart, and he knows a lot about the history and theory of fascism. And I found, he's made the point on several occasions, which I've echoed on my Substack, which is that you don't usually get fascism like imposed from the core in all places at once. It's not like really you ever have an election where someone runs as a fascist and says, vote for me, and I will transform our country into a right-wing totalitarian dictatorship. What you have are people on the further, harder right who run, win, and then sort of expand their control and impose it piecemeal throughout the system, step by step. And that even goes for Hitler, although for Hitler it was accelerated pretty quickly because of the Reichstag fire and the way that played out with the way the Weimar Constitution had within it Article 48, which was like a red button saying emergency powers, press here. And he was able to just do that very quickly and consolidate dictatorial powers very quickly. But what I've seen, I think, in Minnesota over the last month has been a sort of experiment, a first experiment of the Stephen Miller faction in the administration saying, in effect, let's give this a try. Let's see what we can get away with here. Let's see if we provoke this left-wing population on the streets of Minneapolis to overreact to us so that we can use that as a pretext to invoke the Insurrection Act, impose martial law here, and get public support for having done so. And if so, then we effectively have imposed fascism on the city of Minneapolis. And if they could do it there, then that would be a kind of script that they could repeat in other places, especially in places leading up to the midterm elections next November, where, if you could go into a lot of Democratic-leading urban areas and suppress the vote there, that could definitely help the Republican Party to maintain its hold on the House. So that's sort of what I see and how it interacts with my historic openness to trying to understand the right from the inside through a kind of empathy, a kind of empathetic analysis of the right. I still am interested in exploring the right-wing ideas, conservatism, reactionary thought, but in facing the actually existing implementation of this in our own country in real time, I am sometimes roused to hit back a little harder now.
Do you think that there's a chance that the Trump administration might successfully rig the midterm elections?
I think it would be really hard to do. Now, Trump talks as if that's what he wants to do. He said just yesterday, Monday, February 2nd, that he wants to nationalize elections, take over elections in lots of places, which for him are always Democratic-leading places like Philadelphia. But, American democracy is pretty decentralized by democratic standards in the world. And then American elections are especially decentralized. They're all run by the states. They are, they're often run by Democratic-dominated, state officials. And so, the very right-wing Republican presidential administration, and even now, while the Republicans narrowly still control both houses of Congress, the ability of these federal parts of the government to kind of reach down to the state and local level and interfere is sort of limited by our system. Now, the one way that they could cause a lot of mess is through ICE and Border Patrol. If these people are sent into certain strategic places and then show up and sort of act as a kind of federal presidential police force, a sort of enforcement mechanism for the interests of the right-wing administration, at polling places to kind of scare away anyone with dark skin because they're afraid, because there is this track record, again, as I said earlier, of not just taking on people who are here without documentation, so-called illegal immigrants, but anyone who looks like they may not be like a white American, so Hispanic, Latino, Black. If that whole population, which in cities tends to vote for the Democrats, if they're afraid to go vote because they're afraid they're going to be harassed, detained, picked up, even deported, let alone deported to like foreign jails, to El Salvador and other places, that could really depress the vote. Now, these are all places where the vote is so heavily skewed toward Democrats that they'd have to suppress it enormously. Like, are the Republicans going to suddenly win Philadelphia? Like, I don't think so, because these are at least local House races. So, where if I'm Trump and I want to manipulate the election so that Republicans maintain control of the House, what you really would need to do is like send ICE into lots of swing districts where Republicans at least have a shot of winning, and then try to suppress the Democratic vote a little there, because that's where it could make a difference. But I don't really see that happening. Now, at the level of the Senate, if you're in a swing state where the whole state is voting for the senator and it's very close, and you really suppress the vote in high population centers that are heavily Democratic, that could conceivably swing a Senate result, so that a Republican senator would win over the Democrat, where the Democrat maybe would have won by a point or two without the interference. So I would say it is possible, not in the direct sense of like the federal government going in and like throwing out tons of ballots and cheating in that way in the vote count. That I think would be more difficult. But in suppressing the vote through intimidation, if pursued, it could happen. And then whether it would be effective in the sense of actually throwing the results, it's possible, but it would be difficult.
All right, so I want you to paint two scenarios into the heads of the audience, where the first scenario is that everything goes well and the midterm elections are completely free and fair. The second scenario is that they were able to intimidate people and depress the vote such that Democrats don't really win the midterms. Like, how do we ensure that scenario A occurs and not scenario B?
I don't really know. I'm always bad on like, what do we do? I mean, I don't know exactly how to ensure that this doesn't happen. I think probably the best case is to kind of see where it looks like the administration is sending forces in the weeks leading up to the vote. And in those places, maybe Democrats, liberals organize kind of citizen patrols to kind of show up at those same polling places to defend voters, put a lot of lawyers on the ground, have a lot of judges available to issue injunctions, to get the ICE officers and Border Patrol to stand down and not intimidate voters, things like that. But, that's a lot of people, and it's a lot of organizing, and it's all focused on one date in the future, and trying to, make that work without it also, spinning into like election day chaos where you actually have a lot of violence at polling places, would be really tricky, and it would be quite dangerous. And if it gets sufficiently dangerous and violence, then we're automatically like flipped over to your second scenario, the much scarier scenario, where actually the election day becomes kind of a mess. There's a lot of violence. The vote ends up suppressed. And it ends up conceivably throwing the election to the extent that Democrats fail to take the House despite polls showing that they should be winning. That is a terrible scenario. Like that, not only for the direct, obvious reason that the Democrats will have lost by having been cheated out of it, but the knock-on effects from something like that happening on the viability of our very democratic system, really terrible, because like Democrats would so quickly, immediately lose faith in our system to deliver fair and free election results that they would begin checking out of the system and turning to extra electoral means of gaining power. And that's the road to civil war, which I don't think we have the right conditions for a standard kind of civil war where you have the U.S. Civil War, the Yugoslav Civil War, where you have like lines on a map and forces on different sides fighting over territory, but you have something like the Troubles in Northern Ireland, where like civil society and civility just kind of break down. You have terrorist violence, and then you have government forces coming in and using violence to suppress the terrorism, and then that provoking more terrorism, and a kind of just a breakdown of public life with violence, with political violence spiraling out of control. And that is bad. That's really, really bad. And I don't know, beyond what I said about simply sending in people on the other side to try to ensure that ICE can't accomplish its vote suppression attempts. That's kind of the best advice I would have, and it's kind of vague because I'm not an on the ground guy. I don't know about community organizing, let alone at a higher level of organization in the community, like how one would do that at a national level and know where to send people and exactly how they should be trained to do that kind of work. That's beyond my expertise.
There is one quote that you have in one of your articles about how maybe your temperament has changed a little bit, at least in your writing, where you say, indignation comes naturally to me, and I fear it and distrust it. Much of my commentary, with its calls for empathetic imagination about those with whom I disagree with on the right, grows out of this fear and distrust. I look for ways to short-circuit, thwart, and restrain my natural inclination to lash out in rage, because I know from experience how much it can distort my judgment, leading to rash words and deeds that I come quickly to regret." End quote.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm trying even in this conversation to be as reasonable and measured as possible and not simply like leaping to conclusions or accusing the Trump administration of doing things that are illegitimate beyond what not from like indignant reaction to what I'm seeing, but by analytical, rational thinking of it through. So I'm continuing to abide by what I said in that quoted passage. I think it's also necessary to make a distinction between, trying to restrain an instinct toward indignant anger in theoretical analysis versus action. And in action, indignation can have its place. It's a motive force in the soul. It gets us to get up and do something and actually go out and try to make a difference in the world. So that's all to the good. But when it comes to the analysis part of it, I still think that it's best to try to restrain that and to try to think as dispassionately as possible. But the thing is that I think I still do that and am capable of doing that. It's just that what I see the Trump administration doing, my dispassionate analysis of what it's doing is, wow, this is really bad. He's acting as if again, I would say this up to around the time he slightly took his foot off the accelerator in the wake of the Preddy killing over that next week. He sort of backed off. Now he's sort of coming back and putting it down a little bit more again. So it's always in a state of adjustment. But up to the days after the Preddy killing, I definitely thought that what I was seeing was the Trump administration following that Stephen Miller scenario. Like, we're going to provoke a conflagration on the streets of an American city so that we can use it as a pretext to invoke the Insurrection Act and seize even more dictatorial power. And when I started to see that that's what they were doing, basically create their own Reichstag fire, I thought it was time to start ringing the alarm bell. And I hoped that, given my very long track record, including, having to be the subject of a fair amount of abuse by critics over the last 10 years for being insufficiently rabid in my Trump hatred, I hope that, given that track record, that if I start ringing the alarm bell, it would lead to, responses from people like, whoa, even Damon Linker is saying this is really bad, and that might have a marginal positive effect on the debate, debate in the public square.
Yeah, well, it does seem convincing to me, given your track record in the past, but it does make me wonder, like, the sense of anger and indignation that you have, that you're even, like, you're trying to temper yourself right now, I can tell. Do you ever wonder if temperamentally you're turning into the type of person that you would have critiqued or even ridiculed during Trump's first term?
I don't think so. Again, because I think at the level of analysis, I'm still dispassionate. It's just that in the pieces I've written in the last few weeks where I'm more indignant about what they're doing and kind of issuing a kind of call to arms against it, that's sort of post-analysis. Like, the analysis, I think, is sound and dispassionate, but now on the basis of that, like what I expected, like, I wrote about this very pretextual invocation of the Insurrection Act and some pieces I wrote for the Substack and for Persuasion in the couple of months before the last election in 2024. So I knew this was possible. And so in that sense, I'm not surprised, but I am still nonetheless sort of shocked that it's happening and happening so aggressively, in the sense that I knew it was a possibility, but I still considered it back then sort of tail end likelihood, like maybe 10 to 20%. But, here we are a year in, and we're already seeing examples of it happening, which means that actually it was more than a 10 to 20% chance. I mean, maybe that's literally what it was then, but now we can see that actually, like, this might have been planned from day one. Stephen Miller might have hoped to proceed in exactly this way from the beginning. So I do not think that I've kind of given up my old approach, and don't think I've contradicted myself in any kind of a deep way on it.
Final question. What would you say that you're very hopeful for when it comes to the future of American electoral politics?
Well, I mean, I would like to see what I actually think, all things being equal, assuming the Trump administration doesn't so undermine faith in free and fair elections that we can't actually have elections anymore, which I don't think is especially likely, but assuming that doesn't happen, and we keep having free and fair elections, I would expect the Democrats to win at least the House by a pretty solid margin this November. I don't know about the Senate. We'll see. And there, I think it's a much harder thing. But even if we win the House, the Democrats win the House, okay, that's at least something. And then I would, my recent analysis of what populism means points to it meaning maybe nothing more than a tendency of the voters to be perpetually grumpy and to want to throw the bums out, whoever the bums happen to be at any given moment. And that would seem to indicate that at least in national elections where you can't sort of gerrymander in a safe district, that we're likely to see that in 2028, the incumbent advantage doesn't exist and Trump can't run again, supposedly, so it's going to be Vance or Rubio or somebody else on the Trumpy right. I would think that they're going to have a hard time winning. And so I would expect the Democrats to probably be the favorites going into 2028. And I would be very pleased if that could happen. But I would want to see the Democrats run in a way that tries to begin a process of appealing to swing voters in a more long-lasting way. Not just vote for me because you hate the person in charge right now, namely Trump and his minions, but vote for me because you actually think that I and the Democratic Party stand for values that you believe in as well. So I would like to see the Democrats, what this means substantively, following the writings of lots of people on the center left, like Matthew Iglesias and many others, would be to moderate on some cultural issues and make a broader kind of economically based appeal in favor of growth and in favor of governing the country responsibly with an actual like substantive agenda rather than just anti-Trump sentiment. And so that would be a path forward that might not work, but it would at least open the promise of getting us out of these perpetual populist cycles of throwing the bums out.
Damon Linker, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this podcast.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me. Take care.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to hear more, make sure to follow this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else that you get your podcasts from. Until next time, goodbye.